In these last sessions, we're going to be getting into the Global Integrated Monetary Fiscal Model, which was one of the multi-country models that was developed with Douglas Laxton and a bunch of co-authors at the International Monetary Fund. I'm going to be going into who actually was involved in that project once we get into the details. Now, why are we interested in those types of analytical frameworks? Our team is in the process of rewriting everything from scratch, including the software, including the theoretical analytical parts of the model, doing them in continuous time. GIMF was done in discrete time, but in addition, GIMF basically, as we're going to show, just ran out of space to develop because of analytical tractability issues. So in the models that Douglas Laxton developing now with people at the Central Bank of Armenia and the National Bank of Georgia, as well as Hamid Farouki, who basically did the early work with Doug in the 1990s, developing the foundations of all these multi-country DSG models, which are extensions of Olivier Blanchard's work. Now, why do we care? Well, for the very same reason that Charles Goodhart cares. They deal with issues that have different layers. One layer is demographics and aging. So, for example, Olivier Blanchard has pointed to aging as being one reason why he thinks that the equilibrium real interest rate has been on a declining trend, and why we might go right back into that world where central banks are constrained by the effect of lower bound on interest rates. And that would be pretty problematic, like a number of dimensions that would bring up the risk of things like fishery and deflations because of central banks being constrained by the effect of lower bound on interest rates. So fishery and deflation mean Great Depression economics and so on. And you can imagine countries like Japan or Korea that are facing enormous aging issues. In Japan, for example, over 10% of the population is over the age of 80 and so on. So demographic trends are the first layer aging, but not all countries are aging G. So in that particular example, it's going to be from the Philippines and so on, but also using technology. So the way we think about those three layers are layer one, demographics aging, layer two, what we call migration economics. But it doesn't have to be migration in terms of necessarily living in Japan. It could be that you have a work permit system where you import labor to help you take care of old people. So then the third layer is technology. And so you can think of this as robots. Can we use labor-saving technology in different sectors of the economy to replace the labor in those economies where they're facing shortages in particular types of skills? For example, skills to take care of elderly people will be a combination of high-skilled labor and lower-skilled labor. And so how will technology be used to efficiently deal with the problem of declining labor supply? And so how can robots or artificial intelligence? So three layers, but there's also another layer
that is that when we go back to our standard models based on Robert Solow's work, energy kind of dropped out of the equation. And the importance of energy dropped out of the equation because we could, in conventional macroeconomics, we think of the importance of energy as being mainly related to how important energy is as a share of the value of overall goods and services in the economy and so on. And that might not be the case because when an important and reliable source of energy is required to basically automate things with technology like robots, we will need to have the right kind of energy supporting those technologies. And if one thinks about that, you will say it's not just energy, it's in general natural resources. So all the resources that are required to make things like computer chips and so on, we have computer chips everywhere in the computer, in my phone, in my virtually everything is sitting in my desk has chips in it, okay? And the question is, so you could say the fourth layer is energy, or you could just say it's natural resources, which are going to be critical if we start thinking about using and designing specifically machines and technology to deal with declining labor problems. Okay, so let's get in a little bit into GIMF. So again, if this quote is relevant on everything we do, so I'm going to be talking about modeling today. And so it's very important for people and for GFS students to understand what distinguishes us at the Global Forecasting School and other people that use these kinds of models and so on. In GFS, we have an expression, never say the model says. And unfortunately, when people come out of school, that's what they're taught. They're taught basically to build models and to figure out what the answers are from these models. But there has to be a clear recognition that a policymaking institution has to function on a much higher level. We can't have elevator economics. And unfortunately, if you don't have a training program in your institution, that takes these people from school and trains them how to be professional economists and not do elevator economics, you will end up with what a lot of major policy-making institutions have right now. So we're going to use this quote, use it, virtually everything we do, but I'd rather have Bob Solo than an econometric model. Okay, full stop. We don't want any econometric models unless we have Bob Solo like economists, and so on. So today I'm going to be talking about the Global Integrated Monetary Fiscal Model, and I'm going to tell you what its strengths and weaknesses are. Its only strength was the fact that there was Ben Hunt that was managing to a large extent the project and making sure that the design of that and the calibration of that made sense, in other words, was consistent with the available evidence and that sort of stuff. But unfortunately, GIMF, as well as lots of other models, were given, again, to people without sufficient training to be professional economists that use them as kind of number crunching machines. And that's incredibly regrettable. Doug shared something really interesting about GIMF. He said,
I have another great thing about GIMF. A lot of these models were developed under the leadership of some truly exceptional economic counselors. For example, Michael Musa, who was the first director of the research department when I joined the IMF in 1993, was instrumental. Back then, we were working on models like MAP, MOD, and others. Michael wasn't exactly what you'd call a huge fan of models, but he strongly believed in the importance of independent research. He saw models as a key part of that. At that time, the multi-country modeling project was a really small operation. It was mainly me, initially with Steve Szymanski, and about half my time was split between that and monetary policy analysis. I also worked with an incredibly talented research assistant, Susanna Mersala. Together, we handled most of the multilateral surveillance before we brought in Ben Hunt and started building a bigger team. Over time, more amazing people joined us. Raghuram Rajan was one of them. I also remember Ken Rogoff asking me to create a model for new open economy macroeconomics. I worked on that with Paolo Pacenti, and we finished it in just 6 months. That became the Global Economy Model, GEM, and it included just about every feature you could think of.
Unfortunately, those style of models have infected our central banks enormously. And we are going to be talking in this presentation about the problems and those infinite horizon representative agent models, because GIMF is going to be based on overlapping generations, but these infinite horizon representative agent models have infected central banks. This model is annual, placing it within what is now commonly branded as microfounded. We will walk you through what people mean by microfounded, allowing you to decide how useful it is. The term microfounded today often resembles reverse engineering, deriving simplified equations for practical application. This approach can be fine if your standard for economic modeling was previously something like David Henry's reduced form econometric models, which frankly were not very rigorous. If that was the kind of modeling you were doing, you might find these microfounded models profoundly insightful because they encourage a departure from such rudimentary practices. However, for critical thinkers, who expect microfoundations to connect with actual microdata. This isn't quite what is meant by microfounded here. Instead, it refers to the application of dynamic optimization theory to derive a set of equations. It is important to note upfront that this model operates annually, making it unsuitable for serious monetary policy analysis. Monetary policy requires a much higher frequency, monthly or even weekly, to capture the nuances of economic activity. Thus, when we discuss the global integrated monetary and fiscal model, it serves more as a broad brush tool to provide a general narrative about monetary policy rather than detailed high-frequency insights. The decision to keep the model annual was deliberate and wise. Attempting to model at higher frequencies using this approach would likely yield nonsensical results. This limitation is similar to the issues with microfounded DSGE, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models with infinite horizons and representative agents. Many central banks estimate these models, but their structure makes them almost impossible to align meaningfully with real-world data. The monetary transmission mechanisms in these models are excessively forward-looking, rendering them impractical for real-time policy analysis. Nonetheless, these models often include an array of nominal and real rigidities and a monetary reaction function. While this setup can be useful, it does not always align well with real-world monetary policy practices. For instance, the current standard for real-time monetary policy analysis is to use an objective function, as we demonstrated in advanced macro policy modeling. However, the strength of this global integrated model lies in its incorporation of multiple powerful non-Ricardian
One key feature of this model is its ability to handle situations where the interest rate exceeds the economy's growth rate, a scenario we currently face. In such cases, fiscal policy must react by adjusting the primary balance aggressively to stabilize debt dynamics. This insight is particularly critical in today's context, given the extremely high levels of government debt and persistent primary deficits in countries like the United States. These conditions put us on a potentially dangerous trajectory, not only in the US, but also in countries like Italy, where high debt to GDP ratios within a monetary union create additional vulnerabilities. Italy's situation is particularly concerning because the European Central Bank, ECB, cannot raise interest rates beyond a certain threshold without jeopardizing fiscal stability. This constraint highlights a broader issue. When economies hit the effective lower bound on interest rates, unconventional policies, such as quantitative easing, often lead to asset price bubbles and higher government debt levels. As interest rates normalize, these conditions can lead to fiscal instability if the interest rate surpasses the growth rate of the economy, as we are currently observing. In such scenarios, central banks may be forced to monetize debt, creating inflation to reduce the real value of debt and restart the fiscal cycle. For Italy, this situation is especially problematic within the framework of a monetary union. The European project, while ambitious, was poorly designed in some respects. Creating a monetary union without a fiscal union, and by extension, without a political union, is inherently flawed. As a result, the European Union lacks the tools to address such systemic challenges effectively. Turning to Japan, a country we have often referenced, we see another set of challenges tied to its aging population. Countries like Japan and South Korea face significant demographic shifts that necessitate coordinated monetary, fiscal, and structural policies. These three pillars are deeply interconnected and must be addressed collectively to manage the economic implications of aging populations. Now let us revisit the concept of Ricardian equivalence. Ironically, David Ricardo himself would likely have found the term misleading, as he was anything but Ricardian in this sense. Ricardo was deeply concerned about the effects of government deficits, spending beyond the revenue generated from taxation. He believed such behavior could lead to excessive consumption, undermining long-term economic stability. Ricardian equivalence assumes that households behave dynastically, caring as much about future generations as about themselves. Under this framework, if a government cuts taxes or increases spending, leading to a deficit, households will anticipate future tax hikes to cover the resulting debt. As a result, they would save the equivalent amount of the tax cut to offset the future tax burden, rendering fiscal policy ineffective.
However, Ricardo himself rejected this idea. He argued that most individuals benefiting from tax cuts today are unlikely to save for future generations. Instead, they would spend the additional income undermining the assumptions of Ricardian equivalence. Modern economic models that incorporate these insights offer a more realistic understanding of government debt's short and long-term effects. One of the critical factors influencing the validity of Ricardian equivalence is the degree of myopia within a population. When individuals prioritize immediate benefits over future consequences, government deficits can lead to increased consumption, higher interest rates, and exchange rate adjustments. These dynamics affect the capital stock and consequently potential output over time. Models that include overlapping generations provide a more nuanced perspective, reflecting real-world behaviors such as finite planning horizons and the importance of life cycle income patterns. These frameworks, building on the work of economists like Olivier Blanchard, Milton Friedman, and Franco Modigliani, incorporate elements like subjective discount rates, enabling more realistic simulations of fiscal policies and their effects on consumption and savings. Governments also play a dual role in the economy. They can engage in productive investment, which enhances private sector productivity, or in wasteful spending, which diverts resources without contributing to GDP.
While the challenges posed by high government debt, aging populations, and fiscal policy constraints are significant, robust models and careful policy design can help navigate these complexities. By addressing the limitations of traditional approaches and incorporating realistic assumptions, we can develop tools to inform sound economic decisions and promote long-term stability. This is how the model operates when applied to a two-country setup. In this instance, one country is labeled home, abbreviated as HHO or HHO in various places, while the other is labeled rest of the world, RW. This framework reflects the methodology Doug developed, which conceptualizes models as having a seed and onion structure. The seed in this methodology serves as a model generator. For example, in a two-country model, inputting home and RW generates the structural code for a basic two-country world economy. Expanding this approach to a five-country model might involve inputting the United States, Canada, the Euro area, Japan, China, and the rest of the world. The seed defines the model's architecture, which connects these economies, detailing their trade and economic interactions. This approach is a significant improvement over traditional econometric models, where equations were estimated individually, assembled, and assessed for coherence, often resulting in models that made little sense. By contrast, the seed-based approach ensures structural integrity from the outset. Once the seed generates the model, the onion concept comes into play. The onion represents the layers of complexity within the model. Each layer corresponds to a specific aspect of the economy, and analysts can peel back these layers to understand the underlying mechanisms. For example, one can study long-run comparative statics by examining the steady-state relationships and stock flow dynamics of the model. This peeling back process allows for a clear view of the connections and feedback loops within a multi-country framework. The modular design also enables analysts to simplify or expand the model as needed. For instance, one could begin with a three-country model and later extend it to a more complex, interconnected setup. This flexibility is essential for understanding various economic phenomena, from fiscal policy impacts to trade dynamics. Countries with aging populations, like Japan and South Korea, face unique challenges. Rising expenditures on healthcare and social security strain fiscal budgets, especially in environments where interest rates exceed economic growth rates. Alternatively, low interest rate scenarios tied to the effective lower bound present other challenges, limiting central banks' policy tools. Models like these are invaluable for central banks, ministries of finance, and financial stability authorities as they address these complex issues. The seed generates the foundational framework, while the onion layers provide insights into the model's intricate details. At the top of the model hierarchy are households, HH, divided into two types. Overlapping generations, OLG, households. These households have finite planning horizons and account for intergenerational considerations. Liquidity constrained, LIQ, households. These households consume based on disposable income and cannot borrow to smooth consumption. Both household types supply labor, which flows into a unionized labor market. The union structure introduces market power and serves as a mechanism for incorporating wage and price rigidities into the model. These unions supply labor to two main sectors. Traded goods sector T. This sector produces goods for both domestic consumption and export. It uses domestic labor, capital, and imported intermediate inputs, reflecting global supply chain dynamics. For example, firms may import components like microchips to produce cars, integrating inputs across borders. Non-traded goods sector, N. This sector produces goods consumed domestically, unaffected by global trade. In multi-country setups, the traded goods sector connects directly to the rest of the world, allowing for imports of foreign labor and exports of goods. This dynamic captures the interconnectedness of global markets and the flow of goods and labor across borders. The model incorporates several advanced features. Sticky prices and wages. Using Dixit-Stiglitz aggregators, the model simulates monopolistic competition and nominal rigidities. These rigidities allow for more realistic analysis of monetary policy and its effects on labor and goods markets. Adjustment costs. Firms face costs when changing quantities or prices, reflecting frictions in real-world economic behavior. Integrated global supply chains. The model captures disruptions in supply chains, such as those experienced during the floods in Thailand, which impacted Japanese car production. The modularity of this framework allows for extensive customization. For example, the model can simulate policies aimed at mitigating aging-related challenges, such as introducing unskilled foreign workers or leveraging robotics to support elderly care. This adaptability makes the model a powerful tool for exploring a wide range of policy scenarios. However, models like this require significant expertise to operate effectively. Developing proficiency with such models takes years of training and a strong foundation in economics. It is not feasible to introduce these models to individuals without prior economic training, as their complexity can be overwhelming. For example, let's consider an experiment involving a labor tax cut of 5 percentage points. In this scenario, the deficit, or savings ratio, changes by approximately 2.5 percentage points, reflecting the fact that labor income is only part of the economy's tax base. The broader effects include adjustments in private savings, real interest rates, and the current account deficit. In a non-Ricardian framework where households do not fully offset government deficits by increasing savings, real interest rates rise to equilibrate the global economy.
For large economies like the United States, changes in saving rates affect global capital markets, influencing real interest rates worldwide. In contrast, smaller economies primarily experience exchange rate adjustments without significant global interest rate impacts. Infinite horizon representative agent models fail to capture these dynamics. They often impose unrealistic equilibrium conditions, such as assuming a zero current account deficit through arbitrary risk premium adjustments. Such approaches lack the depth and flexibility required to analyze intertemporal fiscal policy questions effectively. James Tobin once remarked, "I've never met a long-run comparative static independent of the tension in short-run dynamics." This observation underscores the inadequacy of models that separate long-term trends from short-term fluctuations, especially for fiscal policy analysis. Issues like deficit spending and debt accumulation require models that account for both immediate and longer-term effects, something overlapping generations models excel at. In conclusion, the seed onion methodology offers a robust and flexible approach to modeling complex economic systems. By integrating realistic assumptions and allowing for modular expansion, it provides valuable insights into fiscal policy, trade dynamics, and global economic interconnections. This approach represents a significant advancement over traditional modeling techniques, offering a deeper understanding of economic behavior and policy impacts. The model illustrates a significant dynamic. An increase in government debt of approximately 13 percentage points of GDP over 50 years leads to a rise in the net foreign liabilities to GDP ratio by around 10 percentage points. This relationship demonstrates how government borrowing affects not just domestic economic conditions but also international financial linkages, particularly through its impact on real interest rates. In smaller economies such as Armenia or Georgia, fiscal expansions have relatively direct and proportional effects on net foreign liabilities and debt dynamics. These countries are too small to influence global saving rates or international interest rates. As a result, the relationship between fiscal deficits and debt becomes closer to a one-to-one correspondence. However, in larger economies like the United States, the situation is far more complex. The size and integration of these economies into global financial markets mean that changes in their saving rates or fiscal policies ripple across the global economy, influencing aggregate saving rates, interest rates, and even international trade dynamics. This complexity highlights the importance of understanding the broader implications of government debt and fiscal policies. Before the global financial crisis, most advanced economies operated near full employment, maintaining relatively stable fiscal positions. However, the crisis created a massive economic shock, necessitating large-scale fiscal interventions to mitigate unemployment and close output gaps. This process was interrupted and amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic, which required even greater fiscal responses. Although many economies have returned to full employment, they now face the legacy of this crisis, unprecedented levels of global public debt. The extensive use of fiscal policy during both crises led to a substantial increase in government debt worldwide. For example, the global financial crisis saw aggressive fiscal stimulus measures aimed at avoiding a prolonged recession. Similarly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, governments around the world implemented extraordinary spending measures to support households and businesses, maintain healthcare systems, and stabilize economies. These actions, while necessary, have contributed to a significant rise in global public debt, with implications that will unfold over decades. To better understand these dynamics, Hamid Faruqi, Hiast, Ghassan, and Doug undertook a study at the request of Olivier Blanchard. Goal was to quantify the extent to which increases in global government debt have influenced the world real interest rate. Using overlapping generation, OLG models, and other advanced economic frameworks, they calculated that a 13 percentage point increase in government debt leads to a rise in the global real interest rate by approximately 60 basis points. This result reflects the significant role that government borrowing plays in shaping global financial conditions. The US, being one of the largest economies in the world, has been a major contributor to the increase in global debt. However, it is essential to note that many other countries have also significantly expanded their public debt levels. As a result, world government debt as a whole has likely raised real interest rates globally by somewhere between 100 and 200 basis points. These higher rates reflect the adjustments required to balance savings and investment in a world where fiscal deficits have become more pronounced, while Blanchard and others have argued that demographic trends such as aging populations may exert downward pressure on interest rates. These hypotheses remain speculative without quantitative support. Aging populations may reduce savings rates and slow economic growth, potentially influencing interest rates, but the magnitude and direction of these effects are uncertain. In contrast, findings provide concrete evidence of how global public debt levels are driving changes in real interest rates. This clarity underscores the value of robust quantitative models in informing policy decisions. In large economies like the United States, the interaction between fiscal policy, government debt, and global financial markets is particularly evident. A reduction in government saving due to fiscal deficits necessitates adjustments in global saving rates and interest rates. In a non-Ricardian world, where households do not fully offset government dissaving by increasing private saving, the real interest rate must rise to equilibrate the economy. This adjustment ensures that investment and savings remain balanced, despite increased consumption fueled by fiscal stimulus. The effects of these dynamics differ between large and small economies. For a smaller economy such as Armenia or Georgia, a fiscal expansion primarily results in higher net foreign liabilities and may lead to a depreciation of the real exchange rate to restore trade balance. However, for an economy as large as the United States, the scale of its fiscal policies influences global capital markets, leading to adjustments in global real interest rates rather than just local trade imbalances. This distinction is critical for understanding the unique role of large economies in the global financial system. The implications of rising real interest rates due to increased government debt are far-reaching. Higher real interest rates affect investment decisions, reduce the capital stock, and ultimately lower potential output in the long term. This dynamic underscores the importance of designing fiscal policies that balance short-term economic support with long-term sustainability. Findings also highlight the necessity of sophisticated modeling to navigate these complex relationships. While anecdotal evidence and speculative theories about global interest rate trends exist, they often lack the rigor and precision needed to inform effective policy. Overlapping generation, OLG models, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, TSGE frameworks, and similar tools are indispensable for quantifying the effects of fiscal policy on real interest rates, debt dynamics, and broader economic outcomes. For policymakers, the lesson is clear. Fiscal policies must be designed with an awareness of their long-term implications, particularly in terms of how they interact with global financial markets. Robust models provide the tools needed to evaluate these interactions, ensuring that policies support both immediate economic goals and long-term stability. By combining theoretical insights with empirical evidence, we can develop a deeper understanding of the economic forces at play and chart a path forward that balances growth, stability, and equity. During Doug's time at the IMF, he initiated a collaborative project within the modeling community to standardize fiscal experiments across various frameworks. This effort was invaluable for understanding the complexities of fiscal multipliers and the nuanced factors that shape their effectiveness. One important realization from this work is that there is no universal fiscal multiplier. The impact of fiscal stimulus depends heavily on factors such as the duration of the fiscal measure, the response of monetary policy, and the structural characteristics of the economy. The duration of fiscal measures plays a critical role in determining their effectiveness. Short-term stimulus like temporary tax cuts or one-time transfers often leads to immediate boosts in aggregate demand but lacks the sustained impact of longer-term investments. the monetary policy response is equally significant. During periods of economic slack, such as the global financial crisis, central banks typically accommodate fiscal expansion, allowing fiscal measures to work more effectively. Conversely, in overheated economies, central banks may raise interest rates to counter inflation, dampening the impact of fiscal stimulus. The objectives of fiscal and monetary policies also influence outcomes. When both fiscal and monetary policies are aligned, as they were during the global financial crisis, their combined effects can be substantial. However, conflicting goals such as fiscal expansion in an overheating economy can limit effectiveness. Furthermore, the structure of an economy shapes how fiscal policy impacts aggregate demand. Open economies, for instance, often experience import leakages, where a portion of fiscal stimulus boosts demand for foreign goods rather than domestic output. During the global financial crisis, the IMF and G20 coordinated a fiscal response to avert a global depression. The IMF recommended a 2% fiscal expansion for G20 economies in both 2009 and 2010, which was largely implemented. Coordinated fiscal action significantly amplified the multiplier effect, as import leakages from one country's stimulus became demand boosts for another. This positive feedback loop highlighted the importance of synchronized fiscal measures in global crises. To better understand the role of fiscal stimulus, Doug and others conducted standardized experiments across structural models, focusing on temporary fiscal changes similar to those used during the global financial crisis. These experiments examined various fiscal instruments, including government consumption, government investment, lump sum transfers, and tax cuts. The results varied depending on the instrument and the degree of monetary accommodation. For instance, government investment typically has high multipliers because it directly raises aggregate demand and enhances productivity. Lump sum transfers, particularly when targeted at liquidity-constrained households, also show strong effects, as these households tend to spend their entire disposable income. Tax cuts, depending on their type and target, yield mixed results. The experiments also revealed that the effectiveness of fiscal measures is significantly influenced by the response of monetary policy. Without monetary accommodation, fiscal stimulus is often less effective, as higher interest rates counteract some of the demand effects. However, when central banks maintain low interest rates, fiscal measures can fully stimulate aggregate demand, leading to larger multipliers. This was evident during the coordinated G20 response, where central banks supported fiscal expansions to counter the economic fallout of the crisis. While government investment has high theoretical multipliers, practical challenges often delay its implementation. In advanced economies, infrastructure projects face complex permitting processes, environmental concerns, and public resistance, which can delay their benefits. For example, infrastructure improvements in regions like Fairfax, Virginia, initially increased traffic congestion during construction, highlighting the short-term trade-offs of such projects. Despite these challenges, well-designed infrastructure investment eventually enhances productivity
has
and
validated
economic
many
growth.
of these findings. By using historical narrative methods to identify exogenous fiscal shocks, these studies found results consistent with structural models, underscoring their reliability when properly calibrated. These empirical insights demonstrate the critical role of coordination between fiscal and monetary policies and the importance of tailoring fiscal instruments to specific economic conditions. Fiscal policy, when thoughtfully designed, is a powerful tool for stabilizing economies, particularly during crises. However, its effectiveness depends on coordination with monetary policy, a deep understanding of economic structures, and the careful calibration of fiscal measures. The global financial crisis highlighted the importance of these principles, showing that coordinated, well-targeted fiscal interventions can prevent severe economic downturns and lay the groundwork for recovery. As governments face future challenges, these lessons remain essential for effective economic policymaking. Thank you for your attention. See you.